If you're already melancholic, try dying first and then see how you feel. Welcome, mere mortalites, to another round of the Mere Mortals Book Reviews Christmas edition. That indeed is correct. I'm live here a little bit later than usual, 1 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time on a Wednesday, this being the 25th of December. Merry Christmas to everyone joining in. Merry, Merry, Merry Christmas. Now, as you might surmise, this is where I, Kyron, talk about secrets from beyond my own grave, where I talk about my life, my passions, my loves. No, okay, I'm not going to be doing that today, but we might be talking about how someone else has done that. We have Memoirs Posthumous de Brás Cubas by Machado De Assis, the English translation of that being the Posthumous Memoirs of Brás Cubas. So this book was published in 1881. It is a classic book, 366 pages. Probably took me 25 plus hours reading to get through in total. There's a reason for why that took so long. I will get into that closer to the end of the book review. So this is a reflection of memories or memoirs from a man who lived in the 19th century in Rio de Janeiro, so Brazil. And it's a reflection of his life after he's already died. So the whole premise of this is he talks about his death right at the start of the book, and then he goes through his life, all of the events leading up to his death. So he's narrating his own life, and it's rather melancholic. It's got a fair tinge of sadness, I think, to it. What we see in this is his affairs, his passions, his loves, a little bit of his work. We get to know his temperament, his friends, his family, what kind of life Brás Cubas lived, and it's more about him, not so much about the setting of Brazil. I think you could really almost transpose him for living in France, for example, and you will still get the same sort of effect. So it's much more about the emotions, the man, rather than the environment and the setting. Now, it's composed of 159 chapters. What distinguishes this book is stylistically is its chapters, I think, and also the novel style that it uses. So we get these very, very short chapters, sometimes being only a page long, if that. I don't think any chapter went more than like 6 pages in total. And they'll have titles like A Mysterious and Capturing, I think that was, The Pendulum. Sometimes it'll just be a bunch of dots as the title. So, you get a bit of everything in this. It's also got quite a lot of footnotes at the bottom here. Well, not quite a lot of little footnotes here and there where he's referencing individual passages or particularly other literature art, which we'll also talk about a little bit later. So let's jump into the themes and questions that arise from this book. And I think the main one that arose from me is the effect of time on emotions and memories. And can you create accurate, i.e. fully finished memoirs before you actually pass away? A lot of people tend to do this. Like, there's the memoirs of Richard Branson, for example, that are out there. Is your interpretation of memories ever fixed in stone? Will an event that occurred in your life, you always view it the same sort of way? So we're really tackling the aspect of death when it comes to the narration on one's life. Enter our narrator, Brás Cubas. So we begin on his deathbed. He's dying of pneumonia, and we have this mysterious woman come and visit him. We're like, ooh, there must be some sort of story behind this. And we then jump back in time to his childhood. We see he was a rather naughty child, rather mischievous. Even mischievous is probably the wrong word. He was a bad kid. He was a bit of a bully and a meanie. And as we see him, we grow up, we realize, like, okay, he's come from a rather rich, wealthy family for the time in Brazil, in Rio. And we see, his love affair. He falls in love with a prostitute named Marcella, squanders his family fortune almost on her. So his dad kicks him out, ships him overseas to Europe, where he studies law, lives a bit of a bohemian lifestyle before coming back home, and is really affected by the death of his mother. We then kind of see just over the subsequent pages, his growing up from teenager to adult, decisions on fitting in with the society, what he should do with his life. He's rather carefree. He doesn't really need to work, but he goes into politics to, I don't know, it seems to like please his father / have something to do. This girl that he wanted to marry, Virgilia, doesn't end up happening, but he ends up having an affair with her later, as she is married to another prominent politician. We see the comings and goings of this. A lot of the book is focused on this affair. And then towards the end of his life, we see him like reconnecting with his sister, old friends, family friends, work colleagues, with all of these having I would say a slightly negative connotation or unpleasantness to all of these meetings. Ends up with his mellowing out of things and of his life just before his death. Now, Brás Cubas seems like an emotionally unstable guy, is how I would describe him. Not only is he swept up by his emotions to and fro, but his responses to challenges and events in his life is rather unpredictable. He will prostrate himself before his lover Virgilia, beg her for forgiveness for some minor infraction that he may or may not have committed, and yet other times will completely turn his back on her and be ruthlessly cold and harsh. Sometimes he will be miserly and not give away money at all, and then other times he'll like splash the cash and just be like, oh yeah, whatever. Here's some contos, which is the money that they had at the time. Conto also being the word for story, which confused me a lot when he was like, he's giving out stories. What the hell does that mean? So he seems like a rather dull and lacking person in terms of personality. I found it hard to connect with him. And I think this reflects what happens in his life. He doesn't do much of interest. He's not particularly interested in his job. I can't see that he has any passions or hobbies that he really works on. I don't get the feeling he derives much pleasure from other people. There certainly seems to be no meaning in his life, and even having a moral compass, I just don't really see much in him. He seems almost like a shell of a person, even as we're reading about, the middle of his life, the joy of his life. Sure, he has things going on, but it seems rather self-centered, if I had to say, and, just describing him as a person prone to catastrophizing and looking on the negative side of things is how I would describe Mr. Brás Cubas. Now, what is fun, I guess, to think about whether these memories of his are dulled or heightened by his posthumous reflection of them. Is his dying adding to this story in any particular way? And can he really provide the proper context of what he felt at the time whilst simultaneously knowing about his own death? So I guess we're imagining sort of like a ghost type figure writing out these memoirs after he's finished, is how I particularly imagine how this book was kind of intended to be conveyed, and not a person who was writing his memoirs up until the very last day of his life and then died. I really get the feeling like this book was meant to be told from an actual dead person. And so I think it adds a lot of melancholy, to be honest. He's got the completeness of his life, so he can look back over everything. But, when you're writing, even your memoirs, when you're right towards the end of the life, sure, you've done, you've had all the things, there's certain stuff, loves that have been lost or gained, decisions that have been made that cannot be altered by time. But, you're still a person, you still have some autonomy, you still have the ability to think, and there still is this feeling of, okay, I could change things. Even if you're 80, 90 years old, you're very much bedridden. Perhaps you still have your mind with you if you're able to think. But even then, when you're that old, I'm imagining once you die, you kind of revert back to your peak mental health is kind of what I'm imagining is happening here. And that he's not writing this as if he was in the state he was on his deathbed with pneumonia, because that's going to be rather incomprehensible and probably just like pain, all I feel is pain. So I guess I imagine if he'd written this book midway through his life, it would have been very, very different. And even though the same actions occurred in his life, his interpretation would have been very, very different. For example, when he is reflecting on Virgilia, and so if he'd written this midway through his life, I think it would have been a rather happy story. He went through life, he had this heartbreak with this prostitute, Marcella, but he ended up finding this woman, and whilst they might not be married, he still has a connection with her, and it actually gives him more freedom to do what he wants with his life, which I think is probably what he wanted. So if he'd written it midway through, I think it would have been a lot more of a happier book, for example. I think we would have seen a character who was more joyous, and his reflections would have had that tone to them as well. Whereas this one, I think the continued bitterness of his life gave him a perspective that changed the overall tone. So, and this is really reflected in this last chapter here. So I'm going to read out some of this to you, and it's called, so it's chapter 160, I believe this is, CLX, and it's called Das Negativas. And so it says like, between the deaths of Quincas Borba, which was his friend, and himself, he's just talking about this, and this is just the final page. So he says this. Este último capítulo é todo de negativas. Não alcancei a celebridade do emplasto, não fui ministro, não fui califa, não conheci o casamento. And so he's basically saying, like, this ultimate chapter is all about negatives. I didn't achieve celebrity for my poultice, which was his final gift to the world, that he was going to, like a miracle cure, essentially. He didn't get the minister seat that he really wanted. He didn't arrive to be the Khalifa or Caliphate or Caliph, however you want to call that. He didn't even get married. And then he's like, but, you know, I had the good fortune of not having to work for bread with my sweat and blood and tears to live. So, you know, acknowledging he had this, good upbringing in terms of material wealth. I'm not sure how his parents did in terms of raising him, up for debate. And then he also just finishes by saying this, the one thing I can take from this life, this one little piece of joy or of happiness, is that I didn't have children, so I didn't have to transmit. Não transmiti a nenhuma criatura o legado da nossa miséria. I didn't transmit to no creature, nobody at all, the legacy of our misery. Wow, what a way to end a book. And so I think that really gives the impression of how he viewed his life. I wouldn't say he regretted his decisions of his life, of what he did, but I also wouldn't say that he particularly valued his life and would have said it was a good life. It was a life that was lived. There was decisions that were made, good things and bad things happened, maybe slightly more bad than good, and that's about it. But none of it was particularly his fault. Once again, I wouldn't say he was a particularly self-reflective character. And you know, for that time period, he was materially fine. In terms of reflection, I don't think he was good at it, either at accepting the unchangeable things that happened to his life and to people around him, the death of his mother probably being the most notable one, but also reflecting on how he contributed to situations, his decisions. He wasn't flaunting, I would say, his affair with this woman, but everybody in town knew about it. He wasn't discreet about it. He didn't particularly care for the social norms. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm slightly like that myself, but he also didn't realize or didn't care to say, like, there's social norms for a reason as well. It looks strange if you're a bachelor at, 40 years old, 50 years old, and not even had any, romantic entanglements with other women or anything like that. He does end up, I think, marrying one, his sister, I believe, organizes him to marry a very young girl, and she dies shortly afterwards. So it's like, okay, well, even if he tries to, I guess he doesn't have much luck. I like that right at the end of this book, it all comes together. We meet some of these other characters. We see, well, basically all of them are just dying off. His friend goes insane, and we get to see these life paths that he could have taken, or a little snippet of it. What if he'd followed his friend Quincas Borbas and his style of humanitas, his philosophy of humanitas? Would that have changed his life? What if he had married this girl, the lame, and when I say lame, I mean corksas and physically disabled girl, Eugenia? what if he had married her instead? How would his life have been different? You know, we can kind of hypothesize about these, but ultimately it never happens. What happens in the book, and so we just go on with it. So that's about it for the themes and questions for today. Let's jump into the author and some extra details. Joaquim Maria Machado de Assis was born in 1839 and passed away in 1908. As I mentioned, he was a Brazilian author, very well known. When I told people in Brazil that I was reading Machado de Assis, I don't think anyone said, who is that? So he's very well known in Brazil. You know, a Brazilian author of that everyone knows about. He's probably taught in school. They probably have to read his books, etc., etc. He was a journalist, editor, critic, well-versed in the arts, particularly in the theatre. You'll actually learn a fair bit about Brazilian, world history, European, Portuguese, from all of the footnotes, because this character lives over this time period of the 19th century, and so we get snippets of what Napoleon was doing at this time, what this particular piece of theatre came to Brazil, and he's doing things in Rio de Janeiro, so he is part of the world, and so it does have that kind of historical context to it, which I really enjoyed. And then you'll learn little snippets about Portuguese royalty coming to Brazil when they were exiled from or on the run from Portugal, the wheelings and dealings of political people of note during that era, of Napoleon, of Caesar, and not only that, but a lot of literature. He references Shakespeare quite extensively, of Plutarch, of Homer, of Lord Byron, and even some other works that I'd never heard of before. One of these being the 12 Caesars, which is a bit of a historical novel that I particularly want to give an attempt to read someday. So it's really fun in that you get these additional aspects to the book, which I wasn't expecting coming in. Now, I read this in the original Portuguese, so I have the Penguin version here, and Companhia das Letras of this fiction work. So this has some benefits and has some detractions. My comprehension was, I would say, 87% throughout this book. The start was a little bit rough, as is usual when you're reading a book in a second, third, or this is a fourth language for me. And the start, you kind of, and particularly with a start like this, where I was thankful that it was about dying and death. I'm like, okay, I kind of know what is happening here. Then there was some like experimental, visionary, him talking to an angel type figure, and I'm like, oh shit, I'm losing it here. I hope this doesn't continue. Then goes back onto his childhood, and I'm like, all right, I've got this. So I still missed things. For example, I didn't know Marcella, his first love when he was a teenager, was a prostitute. That just completely went over my head, and it was only on reading a synopsis and doing a little bit more reflection on the book afterwards where I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, I missed that. It took me months to read, which usually is a detraction. For a book like this, I actually think helped it. One, because the chapters are so small and so disconnected from one another that I could pick it up at different times and be like not missing anything. I didn't have to remember the whole plot, and I say plot here, whereas it's rather just a very loose story of individual chapters of someone's life. I didn't have to remember everything that happened beforehand, which was good. It was very self-centered. It was all about Brás Cubas, so only a couple of characters in the book. Loved it. And then also, because I'm reading about a person's life, I think reading it over a couple of months really added to that feeling that I got to know this character a bit longer, and it wasn't just a real quick and easy book. It was, okay, yeah, this is an extended period, and this is the memoirs of Brás Cubas. So that actually really helped in terms of the time distortion effects. As usual, you get some very strange words like espingardeado, which means shot, or lépida, which means sprightly. Never heard of those before, likely never will again. This is a common trend I've noticed among Latino authors, probably to do with their languages being a lot larger than English, so they have a lot more vocabulary, especially adjectives, to work with, and they like to use this. And if you go to many of the Latin American boom period authors I've read on this channel before and talked about, you'll notice this as a common occurrence. And to add on to this, there was quite a fair bit of archaic words in this, which I had to learn. So instead of tu being dois or duas, which is what you will say nowadays in Portuguese, he used dos, D-O-U-S. And there was a bunch of other translations that were not easy, and some that were, I just had to go like, I don't know what this means. So I read this book in front of my computer, where I would have the Google Translate up, and I would just a real basic one, type in the word in Portuguese, translate it to English. This works well for adjectives, for names, when I'm unsure if it's a name or not so well. So like nonho, for example, Nhonho. I didn't really understand that was a name until I kind of like midway through the book. Other ones like quitanda, vergalho, tais, and especially when they shorten words. So instead of like esto, it'll be like to. That also did not help me at all. And, part of this is due to the book being very old, written in the 19th century. It probably has some adjustments to the language to be able to get it up to date with current Portuguese, or current Brazilian Portuguese, I should say. But I think it stayed true to the original pretty well as well. I got the feeling that not too much was altered, and I did read a bit of the translator notes at the beginning of what they did and didn't do. So perhaps if I dug into those words a bit more, I could have understood more of these. But because of just the way that I'm reading, of why I'm learning Portuguese at the moment, I wasn't interested in understanding this. Whereas I did do something like that for the book Cien Años de Soledad by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. That one I did go through every individual word to make sure I understood it, and learned all sorts of useless things like alcaravan, which is a type of bird that you find only in Colombia. There you go. So let's jump on to the final summary, similar books recommendations. Style-wise, I find he alternated nicely between keeping the life story. So there was no plot to this book. It was just, here's my life story. Moving forward with inner dialogue and philosophical ramblings and reflections. So I found it still moved forward even though these things were in there, which is hard to do. That's really hard to do, because there's many books which will do that, and many books which fail at keeping it interesting. So I can't say I was ever bored, and even if there were parts that I were having trouble understanding, a lot of this being due to the language, a lot of this being also due to the humanitas and reflections or philosophical ramblings of Quincas Borbas, for example. And that was a little bit harder, but I didn't feel like I had to plow through this book. It still was good. I reckon a lot of this is due to the smaller chapters. I could come in, read for 20 minutes, do some like work on the book, and then bounce out, and it didn't feel like I'm missing things, much like other books. So what it would be like in English if I read this, I think it still would have been entertaining. But I always like doing these in the original if I can, if my language skills are up to it. And I feel they were. I think the comprehension I got from this book was worth it. It was probably on the boundary point, a little bit less than this, and I would have struggled. But the style the book was written, and the chapters, the subjects, everything about this combined to make it really readable for someone like me who's reading in another language. So worth it for extending your repertoire. In terms of if this was just in English, I think it would still be worth it for the style and what you'll learn about 19th century Brazil and this character. So I'm going to give it a very solid 7 out of 10. The Posthumous Memoirs of Brás Cubas by Machado De Assis. Memoirs Posthumous de Brás Cubas. So what can I recommend to this book as well? It does very much remind me of other translations of other Latino books. The main one being The Death of Artemio Cruz. That would probably be the closest one. That's Carlos Fuentes. So this I found much more readable though. Actual comprehension was much better. He has a simpler way of writing than many of the other Latino authors. And although he still uses many words, they're usually synonyms bunched together, so it's just not as difficult as many of them. All right, final sections here, Value for Value podcast. As always, This podcast will be free, available anytime, anywhere, any place for anyone. No sponsorships, no wheelings and dealings with authors behind the scenes. This is just the books that I enjoy reading and that I hope you enjoy hearing about and reading as well. So you can help support this podcast in many ways. Sharing it with a friend, talking about it to someone, giving me book recommendations you think I would enjoy, and then finally financial support down below. In the show notes, we've got a PayPal link and meremortalspodcast.com/support are some other ways that you could help support this show. What is coming up in the future? Well, I will continue to be going live, hopefully 11 a.m. on New Year's Day, although I might be slightly hungover, so it is possible that I'll do a later one for that as well. What other books are coming up? I'm reading a unnamed, as of yet, autobiography. That'll be fun. Next week should be The Devil Take the Hindmost by Edward Chancellor. I do have a book on pickup artists that I wanted to talk about at some point. I need to start reading that. I also have this one here, The Alchemist, written in the original Portuguese as well, O Alquimista, which I will leave right here to remind me to start reading that. And then, yeah, other stuff. Other stuff is coming. Always more book reviews to be done. So, in general, I'm going to be live 11 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time on a Wednesday. And I really would love it if you could join in at some point, because it is really nice and fun having that live aspect to this as well. So I really do hope you're having a fantastic day wherever you are in the world. Ciao for now. Kyron out. Adios. Bye.